Edit. She never stopped saving lives. Western Germany. April 1945. The war was almost over, but death had not received the message. Smoke drifted above the shattered rooftops of a small town outside Cologne, where church bells had long since fallen silent, and brick dust floated through the morning air like gray snow. Every street carried the scars of retreating armies. Every broken window reflected a country collapsing under the weight of its own history. The field hospital had once been a Catholic school. Now it was little more than cracked walls, splintered beams, and rows of iron beds crowded beneath a leaking roof. Rainwater dripped steadily into metal buckets, each hollow clang echoing through corridors heavy with the smell of iodine, damp plaster, and blood. Inside, one person still moved with quiet purpose. Anna Weiss, 24 years old, a German nurse. Her white apron had long ago surrendered to mud, ash, and dried crimson stains. Loose strands of blonde hair clung to her temples as she bent over another wounded patient. Her fingers remained astonishingly steady despite the distant thunder of artillery rolling across the valley. She tied the final bandage, checked the man's pulse, pulled a blanket over his shoulders, then moved to the next bed without saying a word. Outside, the sound of engines grew louder. American jeeps. The hospital staff froze. Several orderlies abandoned their carts and disappeared through a rear doorway. A doctor quietly removed his armband before slipping into the basement. Someone whispered that the Americans had arrived. Only Anna remained exactly where she was. A teenage civilian lay on the operating table, his breathing shallow, fragments of brick embedded deep beneath his ribs. She reached for another clamp. The doors burst open. Boots struck broken tiles. Rifles swept across the room. Soldiers entered in practice formation, their uniforms damp from the spring rain. Captain James Carter stepped through the shattered entrance with his pistol raised. 32 years old. Medical Corps. Ohio-born. He had crossed France, survived the Ardennes, and treated more wounded men than he cared to remember. Experience had taught him that abandoned hospitals often concealed desperate soldiers, hidden weapons, or carefully prepared traps. His eyes searched every corner. Then they stopped. A lone German nurse, still operating. She did not look at him, did not flinch, did not surrender. She simply continued stitching the wound before her, counting each movement beneath her breath as though the rifles surrounding her existed in another world. One of the American soldiers shouted. In English. She gave no answer. Another step closer, his rifle aimed directly at her back. Captain Carter raised one hand. Hold! Silence settled over the ruined classroom. Only the soft scrape of surgical scissors could be heard. Anna finished the final stitch, placed fresh gauze over the wound. Only then did she slowly remove her gloves. She turned. Her pale blue eyes met Carter's for the first time. There was exhaustion in them, grief, weeks without proper sleep. But there was no fear, no hatrith, no plea for mercy, only the calm expression of someone who had decided, long ago, that every heartbeat was worth protecting, even when the world around it was falling apart. Captain James Carter lowered his pistol by a single inch. He had entered expecting to find an enemy. Instead, he found a woman who had refused to stop being a nurse. Nếu muốn đúng nhịp dư chân của video YouTube dài, phần 2 sẽ mở bằng cuộc thẩm vấn và câu nói duy nhất của Anna, 3 phút trước khi từng lớp bí mật của cô bắt đầu được hé lộ. Captain James Carter stepped forward before anyone else could speak. His eyes moved slowly across the room, taking in every detail the way years of battlefield medicine had taught him to do. He noticed the nearly empty shelves where medicine should have been stacked. He noticed blankets patched so many times that no two squares matched. He noticed frightened faces waiting for answers no one seemed ready to give. Then he looked back at the young nurse. She stood quietly beside the operating table, her hands freshly washed despite the shortage of clean water, her expression calm in a place where calm no longer seemed possible. "Do you speak English?" he asked. She hesitated for only a moment before answering. "Enough." Her voice was steady, almost gentle. "What is your name?" "Anna Weiss." Nothing more. No explanation. No attempt to justify why she had remained behind. James waited for additional words that never came. Silence settled between them, interrupted only by the slow tapping of rain against broken windows. One of the American soldiers began searching nearby cabinets, while another carefully inspected adjoining rooms. They found no hidden weapons, no military radios, and no signs that the building had ever been used for anything except caring for the sick. Even so, something continued to trouble James. It was not what he saw. It was what he could not explain. Most civilians greeted liberation with relief. Others reacted with fear. Anna showed neither. She simply watched every movement inside the room, especially whenever one of his men walked near the hallway leading deeper into the old school. It was subtle enough that no one else appeared to notice, but James did. Years of reading frightened patients had taught him that the smallest glance often revealed more than the loudest confession. "Is anyone else here?" he asked. "Only people who need help," she answered. The response sounded truthful without actually answering his question. James looked toward the dark hallway again. Water dripped somewhere beyond the doorway in a slow, steady rhythm. The corridor disappeared into shadow, ending at a heavy wooden door that remained firmly closed. There were no warning signs, no locks, nothing unusual at first glance. Yet Anna's eyes found that door again for the briefest second before returning to him. It lasted less than a heartbeat, but it was enough. James quietly instructed the rest of his men to continue checking the building while he remained behind. For reasons he could not yet explain, he had begun to suspect that the greatest secret inside the hospital was not hidden behind walls. It was hidden inside the silence of the woman standing only a few feet away. The soldiers returned one by one, each with the same report. Empty classrooms, broken furniture, storage rooms stripped nearly bare. Nothing that resembled a military position. Nothing that justified the quiet determination James had seen in Anna's eyes. One corporal paused beside him. "Captain, the building is clear." James nodded without answering. He rarely argued with evidence, yet experience had taught him that the absence of proof was not always proof of absence. He thanked the men and instructed them to establish a temporary medical station outside while he completed his inspection. None of them questioned the order. They respected his instincts because those instincts had brought many wounded men home alive. As boots faded into the rain, the old school grew strangely peaceful again. Anna returned to her patients as though the interruption had been no more significant than another passing storm. She replaced damp cloths on fevered foreheads. She adjusted pillows beneath tired shoulders. She offered warm water to an elderly woman whose trembling hands could barely hold the cup. Every movement appeared practiced, patient, and remarkably ordinary. James watched without speaking. He had spent years in military hospitals across Europe. He knew the difference between someone performing kindness for an audience and someone who had forgotten there was an audience at all. Anna never glanced toward him to see if he approved. She never tried to explain herself. She simply continued working because the work needed to be done. That unsettled him more than any dramatic display could have. A frightened little girl sitting near the window suddenly began coughing. Before anyone else reacted, Anna crossed the room, knelt beside her, wrapped a blanket gently around her shoulders, and quietly began humming a melody James did not recognize. The child slowly relaxed. Her breathing steadied. Her eyes closed for the first time since he had entered the building. James found himself wondering how many nights that same song had carried frightened children through the darkness. "You have been here a long time," he finally said. Anna nodded once. "Long enough." Again, the answer revealed almost nothing. Rain continued tapping against shattered glass while wind carried the faint scent of wet pine through broken walls. Somewhere upstairs, an old floorboard creaked, though no footsteps followed. James instinctively looked toward the sound. Anna did not. She remained focused on the patients, almost as though she had expected the noise. It lasted only a second, yet another small question quietly joined the growing list in his mind. If the building was truly empty, why did it still feel as though someone else was patiently waiting for the right moment to be found? James remained in the old classroom long after the others had finished unloading medical supplies outside. He told himself he was verifying the building one final time, but deep down he knew that was no longer the real reason. Every answer Anna gave seemed complete enough to sound honest, while quietly leaving another door unopened. He had interviewed frightened civilians before. Fear usually made people speak too much or too little. Anna did neither. She spoke only when necessary, and every word landed exactly where she intended. The morning slowly settled into an uneasy routine. Rain softened into a light drizzle. Patients rested beneath patched blankets. Outside, American medics began treating anyone who arrived, asking no questions beyond what was necessary to provide care. James noticed Anna watching through the cracked window for a brief moment before returning to her work. She was not watching the soldiers. She seemed to be listening for something beyond them. A few minutes later, the distant ringing of bicycle wheels echoed across the empty street. A boy no older than 12 appeared through the mist, balancing a wooden crate across the back of an old bicycle that looked barely strong enough to carry him. He stopped outside the school, looked around carefully, then carried the crate inside without saying a single word. James stepped forward. The boy froze. Anna gently placed one hand on the crate before James could open it. "Fresh bread," she said quietly. "From the monastery." James looked at the rough wooden box. The smell of warm bread drifted through small openings between the boards. It seemed ordinary enough, yet something about the exchange felt rehearsed. The boy avoided everyone's eyes. Anna thanked him with a small nod. Without waiting for payment or conversation, he hurried back into the rain and disappeared down the narrow street. James walked to the window and watched until both the bicycle and its rider vanished beyond the broken stone wall. "He comes every day?" James asked. "When he can," Anna replied. "It is dangerous to travel alone." James studied the crate more carefully. Loaves of dark bread rested neatly inside, wrapped in clean cloth, enough to feed everyone for at least another day. He found himself wondering why a monastery with so little would continue sharing what it had. Before he could ask another question, Anna lifted one loaf, broke it carefully into smaller pieces, and handed the first portion to the oldest patient in the room instead of taking any for herself. No one seemed surprised by the gesture. It happened with the quiet familiarity of a habit repeated many times before. James noticed something else. As Anna folded the empty cloth back into the crate, her fingers briefly touched a tiny embroidered cross stitched into one corner. It was almost invisible. She paused for less than a second, then tucked the cloth beneath the remaining bread. James said nothing, but another piece of the puzzle had quietly appeared, and somehow it raised even more questions than it answered. The afternoon passed with surprising quiet, yet James could not shake the feeling that the building followed a rhythm invisible to everyone except Anna. Patients rested. Rainwater continued dripping into dented buckets. Outside, American medics organized fresh supplies while trucks came and went along the muddy road. Nothing appeared unusual until James completed a routine inventory of the medicine cabinet. He counted each bottle twice. Sulfa tablets, bandages, antiseptic, morphine. Everything matched the morning report except for one small wooden box containing penicillin. According to the ledger, 6 glass vials should have remained. Only 4 were there. James checked again. Still 4. He searched nearby shelves, then the treatment room. Nothing. Missing supplies during wartime were never ignored. They could mean theft, desperation, or something far more complicated. He asked one of his own medics whether anyone had borrowed the medicine. The answer came quickly. No one had touched the cabinet since the Americans arrived. James thanked him and quietly closed the ledger without saying another word. Across the room, Anna continued replacing clean dressings as though she had noticed nothing at all. Her expression remained unchanged. If she knew about the missing medicine, she gave no sign. James watched carefully throughout the afternoon. Every patient received exactly what was needed, never more, never less. Nothing suggested waste. Nothing suggested panic. Yet the numbers still refused to explain themselves. As evening settled over the old school, Lanterns replaced daylight with soft pools of amber across cracked walls. The building seemed smaller after sunset, every hallway deeper, every shadow quieter. James volunteered to remain inside while the rest of his unit rotated outside for a warm meal. No one questioned the decision. They assumed their captain was protecting valuable medical supplies. In truth, he was protecting a question that refused to leave him. Hours slipped by. The hospital settled into silence, broken only by sleeping voices and the distant patter of rain. Then, sometime after darkness fully covered the town, Anna slowly rose from the wooden chair beside an elderly patient. She waited, not nervously, patiently, as though listening for a signal only she could recognize. A few moments later, the old church bell somewhere beyond the school rang once. Only once. Anna quietly picked up a worn canvas satchel resting beneath a table. James noticed that she neither reached for a lantern nor hesitated before stepping toward the shadowed hallway. She already knew every step waiting ahead. Remaining out of sight, he followed at a careful distance. The corridor felt impossibly still. Anna stopped before the heavy wooden door that had drawn his attention since morning. She looked over her shoulder one final time. Finding no one, she gently opened the door, just enough to disappear inside. Before it closed again, James caught the faint glow of candlelight where there should have been only darkness. James waited until the hallway fell silent before moving closer. The old wooden floor creaked beneath his boots, forcing him to slow each step. Candlelight slipped through the narrow opening beneath the door, flickering softly across worn stone. He reached for the handle, expecting it to be locked. It was not. The door opened just enough for him to see a narrow staircase descending beneath the school. Cool air drifted upward, carrying the faint scent of wax, fresh bread, and damp earth. He followed carefully, keeping to the shadows. The staircase ended beneath the old chapel, where a forgotten storage cellar had been transformed into something entirely different. Blankets covered the stone floor. Shelves held neatly organized jars of preserved vegetables, folded clothing, and carefully labeled medical supplies. The missing penicillin rested beside clean bandages exactly where it could be reached within seconds. Nearly a dozen people occupied the room. An elderly priest sat quietly reading from a worn Bible to two frightened children. A young mother rocked an infant wrapped in a patch quilt. An older man with an injured leg smiled weakly as Anna checked the fresh bandage around his knee. No one wore a uniform. No one carried a weapon. The room held only ordinary people waiting for another sunrise. James remained perfectly still. Every assumption he had carried into the building began falling apart without a single word being spoken. Anna knelt beside the older man and carefully prepared one of the missing penicillin vials. She explained each step with patient reassurance before giving the medicine, then offered him a small piece of bread and a cup of water. Her attention never hurried. Every movement reflected quiet confidence built through years of caring for others. A little girl approached carrying a stuffed rabbit sewn from scraps of faded fabric. She offered it to Anna with both hands. Anna smiled for the first time since James had met her. It was not a dramatic smile. It was small, warm, and genuine enough to transform the entire room. The child smiled back, then returned to her mother. James realized something that surprised him even more than the hidden shelter itself. Everyone downstairs already trusted Anna completely. Trust like that could not be created in a single afternoon. It had been earned one difficult day after another. Then the elderly priest slowly lifted his eyes toward the staircase. He had seen James standing there. Instead of alarm, the old man simply removed his glasses and gave a slight nod, almost as though he had expected this meeting all along. Anna followed the priest's gaze. Their eyes met across the quiet cellar. Neither of them spoke. For several long seconds, the only sound came from the steady flame of the candles. James had discovered the secret he believed he was searching for. Yet standing in that hidden room, he understood that the greatest secret was not the place itself. It was why a woman with every opportunity to save herself had quietly chosen to remain with people the world had already forgotten. Anna was the first to break the silence. "If you're going to report us," she said quietly, "please wait until morning." James looked from one face to another. No one pleaded. No one tried to run. The children remained close to their mothers. The elderly priest folded his hands. Even the older man, resting against folded blankets, simply watched with calm acceptance. It was not the silence of surrender. It was the silence of people who had already accepted that dignity sometimes meant having no control over tomorrow. James stepped farther into the room. "Who are they?" he asked. Anna answered without hesitation. "Families who had nowhere left to go. Children who lost their homes. Elderly neighbors who could not travel. People who would not survive another week without shelter." She paused before adding, "No soldiers." James slowly looked around the cellar once more. Every shelf had been organized with remarkable care. Every loaf of bread had been divided into equal portions. Every blanket had clearly been repaired more than once. Nothing suggested panic. Everything suggested patience. "How long?" he asked. "Since winter," Anna replied. "Sometimes more people came. Sometimes they left when it became safe. Sometimes they never arrived." James understood the unfinished sentence without asking another question. The priest quietly stood and walked toward a small wooden cabinet near the wall. He opened one drawer and removed several folded papers tied together with faded blue ribbon. "She kept records," he said softly, "not because anyone asked her to, because she believed every person deserved to be remembered." James accepted the bundle. Each page contained careful handwriting. First names, approximate ages, medical conditions, small notes beside many entries. Needed glasses, loved music, allergic to penicillin, afraid of thunderstorms. The details stopped him. Anna had not reduced people to numbers or supplies. She had preserved the ordinary pieces of lives that war so often erased. He closed the papers slowly. Upstairs, the faint sound of approaching voices drifted through the old floorboards. American soldiers returning from the evening meal. James checked his watch by instinct. There was very little time left before someone else might discover the cellar. He looked at Anna. She did not ask him for protection. She did not argue her case. She simply waited for whatever decision he believed was right. That quiet confidence placed a heavier weight on his shoulders than any spoken request ever could. James climbed halfway up the staircase and listened. The voices moved toward the front entrance of the school. One sergeant called his name, asking whether the final inspection had been completed. James remained still for one long breath before answering. Almost he called back, "There is nothing urgent down here." His words echoed softly through the stone passage. Behind him, no one spoke. Yet the silence had changed. For the first time since entering the building, James realized he was no longer guarding a military position. He was guarding a promise that had never been spoken aloud. Morning arrived with clear skies for the first time in days. Sunlight poured through the broken classroom windows, revealing dust that drifted lazily through the quiet air. The hospital slowly awakened as patients accepted warm bread, fresh water, and careful attention from both German and American medical workers. Without anyone announcing it, the distance between former enemies had become slightly smaller than it had been the day before. James noticed it in small moments. One American medic showed an elderly German man how to adjust a crutch until it felt more comfortable. Another shared coffee with the tired priest while they compared photographs of churches from their hometowns. No speeches were given. No declarations were made. Ordinary kindness quietly accomplished what months of fighting never could. Anna continued moving from bed to bed with the same calm rhythm that had first caught James's attention. Nothing about her routine suggested she expected recognition. If anything, she seemed relieved that more hands were now available to help the people she had protected for so long. Shortly before noon, a military truck stopped outside the school. A senior logistics officer entered carrying several inventory forms and a clipboard. He explained that nearby medical facilities would soon receive emergency shipments of food, blankets, and medicine. Every temporary hospital in the district was required to submit updated patient counts before sunset. James accepted the paperwork, thanked the officer, and watched him drive away. As he reviewed the forms, His eyes paused at one familiar question. Total number of civilians receiving treatment. He understood immediately what the number would determine. Supplies, transportation, future inspections. He also understood something else. Listing only the patients upstairs would leave the hidden families without enough food for the coming weeks. Listing everyone would almost certainly expose the cellar. For several long minutes, the pencil remained motionless above the paper. Then James quietly walked downstairs carrying the forms. Anna looked up from arranging fresh blankets. He handed her the clipboard without speaking. She studied the pages, then looked back at him with quiet understanding. Neither of them discussed the risk. They no longer needed to. Together they counted every person beneath the old chapel, including the names recorded inside the priest's careful notebooks. James returned upstairs and copied each total onto the official report in neat block letters. He signed his full name beneath the final page and placed the completed forms inside the outgoing dispatch pouch. It was a simple administrative task, one that would never appear in history books. Yet by choosing accuracy over convenience, he ensured that every hidden child, every elderly neighbor, and every frightened family would receive food and medicine as though the world already knew they existed. Anna watched him seal the envelope. For the first time, she offered more than a quiet nod. "Thank you," she said softly. James shook his head almost imperceptibly. "They should have been counted from the beginning," he replied. Outside, another supply truck appeared on the distant road, carrying hope that arrived not with celebration, but with the quiet certainty that someone had finally chosen to see every life as worthy of being remembered. 30 years passed before Captain James Carter found himself walking through Germany again. The war had become history by then, its battlefields transformed into quiet towns where children rode bicycles along streets once marked by fear. His hair had turned silver. His uniform had long since been folded away. Yet one memory had never faded. On a cool autumn morning, he accepted an invitation from a local historical society restoring the old Catholic school outside Cologne. The classrooms had been repaired. Fresh windows welcomed sunlight once more. The cracked walls had disappeared beneath careful stonework. Only the chapel remained almost exactly as he remembered it. A volunteer greeted him at the entrance and handed him a small display booklet describing the building's history. Most of the pages spoke about reconstruction, local families, and the years of rebuilding that followed the war. Near the final page, James noticed a familiar name, Anna Weiss. Beneath it appeared only a single sentence. She remained in the town after the war and devoted the rest of her life to community nursing until her peaceful passing many years later. There were no medals listed, no military honors, no public speeches, only quiet service. James smiled gently. Somehow that seemed exactly right. The volunteer noticed his expression and asked whether he had known her. James looked toward the restored hallway, where everything had once begun. "Only for a few days," he answered. "But those days stayed with me." Before leaving, the volunteer unlocked a small cabinet inside the chapel. Resting on one shelf sat the faded notebook the priest had protected so carefully. Time had yellowed its pages, but the handwriting remained clear. Every name was still there. Every small detail. Needed glasses. Loved music. Afraid of thunderstorms. James slowly turned each page, recognizing the same careful compassion that had once transformed a forgotten cellar into a place of hope. At the very back, one final note had been added years later in different handwriting. It simply read, "Every person listed here survived the war." James closed the notebook with both hands and remained silent for a long moment. Outside, church bells echoed across the peaceful valley, no longer warning anyone of approaching danger, but welcoming another ordinary day. James stepped into the sunlight, removed his hat, and looked back one last time at the building that had quietly changed his understanding of courage. He had entered it believing that bravery belonged to those who carried authority, uniforms, or weapons. He left knowing that true courage often looked much simpler. Sometimes it looked like a woman who refused to leave the people who needed her most. Sometimes it looked like names carefully written on ordinary paper so that no life would ever disappear without being remembered. As James walked toward the waiting car, he realized history would always remember the victories that ended wars. But the people who quietly protected another human being without asking for recognition were the ones who quietly restored the world afterward.